right?
On the motion, this House should prohibit the advertising of drugs. On teen government, we have UMA, Prime Minister Kai Chiang, Deputy Prime Minister Deborah Wong, and Late Sarah Chong. Reply will be done by Deborah. In opposition, we have IMU Desi Boys, Leader of Opposition Shriya, Deputy Leader of Opposition Hindaraj, with Kiran Raj, and reply by Hindaraj. I could have the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the flu is treatable with any form of drugs you can get from the pharmacy. I also think that regardless of whether or not the origins of the fever, be it hemorrhagic fever, scarlet fever, or even dengue, I think that it's treatable with Panadol. These are all ideas that have been implanted in my mind since young by these pharmaceutical companies with the use of advertisements, right? We see that when you allow advertisements of these drugs to be similarly done in a fashion similar to advertisement of your Samsung Galaxy S5 or your iPhone, it's very harmful to general society, especially considering the difference in this form of products and the goods that we are talking about. This is a stance coming from side government on the side. We believe that drugs is a special category of goods and therefore should not be allowed to be advertised because of the vast effects and immense harm that can be carried out if the people are given the empowerment that they seek to actually do things according to what they want. So this is a mechanism that we want on side government. Simple. We're going to prohibit advertising of all drugs regardless of whether or not they're prescription drugs or regardless of not they are over-the-counter drugs to the general public. Because we believe that at the end of the day, there is a separation between this form of drugs and other form of goods. Secondly, all the supplements that we don't want to talk about, for example, like vitamin C, vitamin B12, are still going to be allowed to be advertised, right? Because you have to recognize the key distinction between a supplement and a drug. A drug is one that has a key distinction of causing a side effect. That means if you take too much of it, you will die. Supplements, to a certain extent, you will die if you take too much vitamin B or C. It's not as harmful as the ones that are drugs because they will cause adverse chemical reactions in your body that will immediately kill you in the same way fashion as drugs. So with that, we have it covered, right? So these are three things I'm going to tell you in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about why the enticement is not exactly good for the consumers. Secondly, I'll talk to you about how doctors will be coerced into giving drugs to the patients and why this is a reversal of power that we don't want to see happen in the status quo. Thirdly, I'll talk about how you give patients a false sense of security and this will ultimately lead to their death. But let's move on into my point, right, on the enticement of advertisement. You have to understand what exactly is the purpose of advertisement in advertisement bit, of course. Number one, they're all profit and marketing driven. That means more often than not, especially when it comes to drugs, your efficacy of the drug is secondary to the sales of your drugs. That means the pharmaceuticals will more often than not try to push as much sales as possible, even knowing that these drugs may not be able to treat certain diseases. That's why in 2013, there was Pfizer was fined heavily by the American pharmaceutical because they promised the people of America that a certain drug will be able to combat the bird flu, even though it's not. But the pharmaceuticals know it very well, but they're still doing it because they want to push sales and they think that people are dumb enough to not be able to do so. And true enough, it's only uncovered years later, in fact, late last year, by the medical profession when they actually found out what exactly is happening, right? So more often than not, these advertisements, they tell you all this short story. They use emotions and unbased hopes to actually entice you into buying that, regardless of whether or not the drug is going to be good for you. But secondly, if side opposition want to talk about how it brings about awareness to the disease, it does not. Advertisements are not education in general because they just blast you with visuals or aesthetics, right? More often than not, the information that they give to you, the so-called things that you see or what fever is just sufficient for you to buy their products and not more than that. That means they're not going to tell you the things, for example, the negative side effects. They're not going to tell you the nature of the disease. More often than not, the nature of advertisements, especially when it comes to drugs, are skewed in view of the good side of the product. That means they're all absolute base. Gleevec, for example, your cancer drug is marketed as your only solution to liver cancer. Imatinib, a cure for flu, is now marketed as the panacea for flu and it's the only thing. More often than not, all these are absolutes that don't tell you the nature of the disease, but just tell you that you should buy them and therefore they are what. Indoctrination of ideas is something that you don't want. Because more often than not, these ideas don't go away when there's a new drug. These are all things that have been implanted to you. Recognize the example that I've told you in the form of Panadol. Even until now, when I'm a bio student, sometimes this form of implicit indoctrination is present in me when I go to the pharmacy and immediately get a Panadol and I don't consult the advice of a doctor. This means it attaches a form of positive idea and promise to you that carries with you throughout your life. And more often than not, in terms of diseases where it may be different in nature, but with similar symptoms, you don't know, and essentially you just go to the one that you're more familiar with. It's a form of confirmation bias that we don't want to see, because it's for confirmation bias that eventually lead to your death. But before I move on to my second point, sure, I'll take one.
What if you're just a person who lives in maybe a semi-urban area and hospital is quite far away, and you have a fever? Are you going to go to the doctor? Or rather watch an advertisement that tells you, oh, Panadol is there and I can buy it over there?
Well, if you have gotten a trip to a doctor, number one is reject the characterization. Even in suburban areas, there are always clinics and hospitals, so we don't think it's so hard for you to seek advice from a doctor. But secondly, even if you lack the advice of a doctor, we still allow these drugs to be permitted in pharmacies. That means you can still consult the consultation of a pharmacist that on the spot will actually tell you what drug to buy instead of relying on your own and going to a random 7-Eleven to buy a form of Panadol. But secondly, let's talk about how it coerces doctors into making bad choices. You have to recognize that in this debate, doctors are the ones who are most capable, and pharmacists to a certain extent, in this job. They have superior skill set and diagnosis, and they know what they are doing in the sense that they access you based on individual basis. That means, for example, when Praveen goes and he has a certain form of genetic defect, the doctors will realize. Or when Deborah goes and they see that, for example, she has blonde hair, people will still realize and prescribe drugs differently. That means more often than not, the prescription of drugs by doctors and pharmacists are on an individual basis. They take into account the nature of what your background is, and then they prescribe you specifically, right? But more often than not, now when you give this patients, they can now coerce doctors into giving them the specific drugs they want because they see it online. And ultimately, even if you talk about how doctors have autonomy, it's not true, because your patients are still the one paying, right? And therefore, with the amount of financial autonomy that they have, they can dictate what drugs they want. The best example of this is when it comes to the Asian market and also antibiotics. More often than not, Asian doctors prescribe you antibiotics even though they know it's unnecessary. Because what the patients want. Because patients now, they coerce doctors into giving them antibiotics. What about my antibiotics, right? These are all cases we see in Malaysia, especially because now patients will have to force the doctors to give them what they want. And more often than not, if this doctor don't prescribe them, they'll simply move to another one. Because we recognize that there's a spectrum of doctors available, but even if, for example, among 10 doctors, there's one doctor that's willing to prescribe you this drug, is bad enough. So let's move into my third idea of false sense of security. To give patients the idea of informed choice that is ultimately flawed. People think they know what they're doing, and therefore it's a culture that you can kill yourself. People will now no longer visit, they're less likely to actually visit this form of doctors. Number one, because of rising healthcare costs. But number two, with the advent of Lord Google and WebMD, they will just go onto there and think that they can treat themselves. Two scenarios under this full spectrum of drugs. If you're talking about over-the-counter drugs, these people will just listen to the advertisement and be like, what opposition want you to believe? They'll just go into the pharmacy and buy it without consultation, or they'll just go into another grocery store and buy it. But the worst harm under this is in the idea of prescription drugs. That means now they will keep the leftover medicines that they have from last time, and they will use it in case the similar symptoms occurring again, without recognizing the true nature of the drug itself, because these drugs have been prescribed to you as the patient to actually treat any form of diseases with that similar symptom. The deadly cocktail I get when you buy different drugs, we need to err on the side of caution, and we are going to ban this for advertisement. We're very proud of the proposal.
Thank the Prime Minister for his speech, and whatever leader of opposition come up to start the speech.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sad government is painting a whole false picture that drugs, every single type of drug is evil, and if you don't have any sort of knowledge about it, or if you just blindly believe that the business you're going to die and you're going to overdose. But let's actually look at logic right now. First of all, there's a reason why it's over-the-counter drugs. First of all, the first point coming from side, or the first thing said by the side opposition Prime Minister is any type of fever can be treated by this one because it's been mentally documented. Based on all I've studied, yes, actually, what is fever? Fever is pyrexia. Pyrexia can be cured using paracetamol. Okay, the point. Next. So I can understand the whole point coming from side government is, okay, they're worried about people becoming self-doctors, or they're going to overdose, they're going to look at Panadol, I'm like, okay, you know what, I'm going to buy Panadol, 20 Panadol right now, I'm going to swallow all of it to cure my fever. That's the picture they're trying to paint. lies and everything, I'll rebut it during my points later. Now, finally, the whole doctor's nature, the whole different people, if there was a blonde, should get treated, etc. That's quite nonsensical, simply because we're physiologically thank you, Douglas. Physiologically and pathologically, we're actually quite the same compared in many ways. You can't just look at a person and say, oh, you have a genetic disorder, my friend. And also the idea of antibiotics and a prescription by doctors themselves is not due to people wanting antibiotics, but let me tell you how doctors actually work. I'm sorry, guys, but we're actually not that good at all. The problem with the whole antibiotics is because we ourselves believe that antibiotics work better than anything else, and that's why we prescribe it. Now, moving on to my own points, which will contradict with Prime Minister's points. First of all, what's the underlying philosophy in today's debate? First of all, we can find that there's a balance between effective health and rapid dissemination helps this. This is what we're standing for inside government, inside opposition. Now, what is status quo? Okay, OTC drugs are usually advertised, and we disagree with one part of the points coming from side government saying that prescription drugs. Look, you can't go and prescribe, you can't go and advertise prescription drugs such as cancer drugs. Like, look, we have iron. All that requires extreme diagnosis, like they say, and we agree with that. Yeah, you need diagnosis for prescription drugs, etc., which you can't just go out and advertise. So we believe that this debate should be focused mainly on over-the-counter drugs. Now, what are over-the-counter drugs? Like common ones: paracetamol, acetylsalicylic acid, aspartame, and antihistamines, and things like salbutamol. These things cure basic diseases such as common cold, acute fever, flu, etc., and things which you don't actually need a doctor to solve. It cures symptoms. It's symptomatic treatments. Okay, not the entire disease. That's something one has to understand. Okay? I'll give you in a while. Okay. First of all, I'll explain in my points later how that the whole idea of going to a doctor will be an extreme burden for people, and I'll justify the why by my final speaker. Now, what is our solution? Our solution is simple. We're thinking in status quo. There's nothing wrong with status quo, and in fact, it's efficient as it is right now. And I'll explain my points right now. Okay, now, how does rapid dissemination actually help maintain basic healthcare? First of all, how is information actually reached to the people? I'll take you just a second. First of all, in two levels. First of all, directly, first-hand watching, and second of all, once my father or my friends start watching, they come and tell me about it. So this advertisement is a new source of influence to the basic health needs towards people like us, okay, or much medical knowledge. Without these advertisements, etc., we won't actually know much about the drugs in the first place, or we won't know how to treat ourselves. Or there's a reason why first aid is shown, or first aid is prioritized. It's a form of first aid before we go and see a doctor if symptoms persist, and that's always stated in the advertisement. Now, if it wasn't for advertisement, people won't really know what drugs cure common things. And the basic thing proposed by side government is to go to a doctor and find out what's going on, or from a pharmacist, which doesn't really make sense, but screw that up. But hold on. Now, why is it a bad thing to actually go for a doctor for a small common disease? First of all, money. Look, some people in urban areas, I think they really can't afford going for consultation every time they have a fever. How often do I fall sick? I fall sick every week or every once in 2 weeks. Don't expect me to go to a doctor and give 50 ringgit every time I see a consultation, when all that I can solve it at 10 ringgit by buying $10. Because most fevers that happens in this world is due to acute symptoms or acute fever, not chronic diseases which is painted by inside government. Yeah, but before that, can I take the Prime Minister?
Sir, is access to over-the-counter drugs mutually exclusive only with the presence of advertisements?
Not exactly, but the thing is, the main thing people find out from advertisement about that's the main way to actually find out about the OTC drugs. Okay. Now, moving on to the entire idea of how you're actually even wasting the doctor's time in this perspective. There's so many important diseases we can focus on, and if every single doctor starts focusing on minute diseases such as fever, and again, it's not feasible for a random, for every time a poor person or anyone for that matter who has a small fever to come and see a doctor and pay 50 ringgit each time to just get a consult. The doctor can be spending his time better, he can be spending his time better, and improving medicine as a whole. Now, my second point I'd like to talk about is the entire idea of research and development. Okay, now, there are millions of people watching a certain, and you want to make sure that you get their attention. Bear in mind, this is where I'm going to text the Prime Minister that you can't lie about drugs. This is not like your perfume advertisement where you spray X and suddenly girls will falling off the heaven. And if you lie about this, you will get prosecuted. That is one case in many that he described. But in most cases, people are afraid of lying about their drugs, and people naturally won't actually lie about their drugs because they're going to get screwed. And let me tell you, medical things that are invisible, you have to gain nothing. Okay, so it is a serious consequence that people won't really gamble on. Now, since there is research and development, since there is advertisement and there is competition. There is more competition between pharmaceutical companies to make the best medicines, more pharmacokinetics, and this is absorbed faster, more metabolism, more excretion, etc., etc., and pharmacodynamics, where the entire mechanism it works faster. There's a reason why now people buy soluble Panadol compared to paracetamol because it's cheap and it's more faster. Now, because of the push, let me tell you how the research is actually impacted by advertisement. First of all, medicine is ever changing, and disease is the most, and mutation of disease is why we need research. But let me look at a different perspective. The incentive due to money is the main way this pharmaceutical actually works is due to supply. So first of all, if there is no supply, there won't be demand, and this is a market that you can adventure on. So if it works for this money generated through advertisement, research itself won't be funded in their paradigm, whereas in our paradigm, we have more money to actually fund into research and cure more diseases, my friend, and to produce the most efficient over-the-counter drugs. And in fact, the entire idea that there is a market will promote or give incentive for these people to actually come in and say, find the best cure, find the best drug. With that, I would like to strongly oppose.
The leader of opposition for a speech. Now, we welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to come to extend the substantial responsibility. Let's drop the issue about me being flawed. Let's look at the real issues of the debate. Several rebuttals. Firstly, why is it not for people living in rural areas? So why is it not good? If they're not able to consolidate, if you're living in that poverty or if you're poor and you're not able to afford to see a doctor very often, I think that is kind of a form of concession that these are the exact group of people. Probably they are less able to, they have less money, they are less educated, possibly, and these are the people that are more susceptible to the influences of the advertisement, which means that initially they were living in a rural area and they have to travel to see a doctor. Right now, they will feel like it's okay to rely solely on the information that they get based on the TV, based on the newspaper that they read, and now they think it's easy for them to always resort to self-diagnosis, especially with the cost of medication. So this is the trade-off. We would rather these people who are poor, who stay in rural areas, to make that inconvenience and to pay that extra cost to see a doctor, because ultimately there's no point in saving some money on seeing the doctor if you are jeopardizing your health in general. Secondly, they contend harms of access to over-the-counter drugs. On one hand, they say people generally don't overdose on over-the-counter drugs, therefore it's not really a huge harm. But then the true harm is not only the problem of overdosing. The true harm of people thinking that they can rely on their own information and not seeing the doctor is that they often ignore small symptoms such as headache, fever, flu, and which are common symptoms to a lot of disease, but they simply dismiss it as merely fever, as merely flu, and don't think of the possibility of these as symptoms to larger disease, which means they always resort to the drugs. And there's a lot of people of seek the doctor and postpone that window. And in that critical window where it's most important for you to see a doctor, you miss that is really, really bad, right? But let's talk about advertisements providing information to people. Firstly, yes, we agree advertisements can't lie or else they will be sued. But what advertisements do is that they don't lie to you. They just don't tell you the full truth. I'm sorry, but no advertisements will tell you it will be 80% effective. And if you take them, if you overdose, you get rashes and palpitations and all forms of adverse effects. No advertisements will ever tell you this informational and educational stuff that people need to know. The most that they tell you, take a Panadol
and enjoy and go back to work. These kinds of stuff are very bad for people because they're not educational, they don't empower people, but solely push them to want to take these drugs. But then let's look at the very important crux. I want to strengthen what Patrick has already told you, the creation that culture of self-sufficiency. Eventually, when pharmaceutical companies try to engage patients directly and try to bypass doctors, try to diminish the role of doctors and diminish people's reliance on doctors, we think over time it creates a culture that erodes the sense of trust between patients and doctors. You tip that power balance. So initially, solely dependent on patients, solely on doctors, and by the way, that's how you guys get jobs. It also people slowly erode their trust. It's more likely they get self-medication. It's more likely that they will try to argue with the doctor. I saw this drug on the commercial. I want this specific drug, and if that doctor refuses, it slowly over time creates dissatisfaction with the doctor. You don't trust the doctor as much. Eventually, people either resort to not seeing a doctor, or they create a dissatisfaction with the doctor, or they just turn to doctors who will comply with their will. And those things are very, very bad. We need to hear more engagement on that part. But let's look at my substantive before I move on. Any questions? Okay, I'll move on first. So let's talk about, when we look at the entry, let's talk about the entry of new pharmaceutical companies into the scene. When we talk about drugs, some of the greatest breakthroughs are done by smaller companies, these startup companies, like for example, Sovaldi, which was the groundbreaking drug to cure liver cancer. It's not liver cancer, or is it some disease? Right. So it was created by Gilead, and those were the small startup companies that were able to make this form of breakthrough because they were able to do a lot of experiments because they had nothing much to lose. And eventually, we think these are the important ways for these companies to come in and be able to penetrate the market and be able to sell their drugs. The problem is when there is a proliferation of advertisements on the market, that huge pharmaceutical companies such as GSK and Pfizer will always get the upper hand, which means they can always rely on their financial prowess, always rely on bombarding consumers with all these advertisements to get ahead, which means on the converse, it does not help the R&D, which they were talking about, because if you want to sell your drugs, you don't need to solely depend on your effectiveness. You can all of that behind the veil of words, behind the veil of advertisement, because you bombard people, and we all agree that advertisements work to help people buy stuff. Eventually, this is how these big pharmaceuticals are able to to consolidate their position in the industry. And that's bad, because eventually these smaller companies who have very great drugs are unable to penetrate the market, and very good medicine are unable to reach the hands of consumers. We would rather a world where there's no advertisement, where people always have to consult either a pharmacist, which is, by the way, free, or you have to consult a doctor. And in those cases, that means the only way where you're able to sell your drugs, the only way where companies are able to make money, is if your drugs are actually effective, which means it generates even more R&D, which means instead of channeling a huge bulk of their revenue, by the way, advertisements don't make you money, they make you spend money. So $1 billion that you come into the advertisement now can be channeled into more R&D, and you have that incentive, because that's how the only way you can sell your drugs. So this debate is ultimately, we would rather not empower people. We want to keep that power balance, keep the doctors, keep patients solely reliant on doctors, and go back to doctors, because that's what most important. We think that's the safest measure. We don't want to empower people with a false sense of security. So ultimately, not only this debate is about empowering the consumers, keeping them safe, it's also about keeping these people having a job.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that. I'd like to invite the CEO to continue the opposition.
notes taken at the professional. Clarify with you some simple basics of treatment, any sort of real world. So, if a patient comes in with fever-like symptoms, joint pains, and as well as triggers, this is your first line of treatment. That's right, paracetamol. Now, apparently, they thought that the doctor would immediately be no, he will not. He will still have to do a treatment test. He may not even be taking anyway. He probably didn't have to come all the way to see this doctor to collect paracetamol, which could have collected at the pharmacy itself. So this is something simple to understand. Doctors will still follow a certain set of procedures, which may be easily explained to patients to allow them to understand that certainly not need the involvement of a doctor, and they can self-treat and self-medicate because it's easy to find and it's not very serious in the first place. Now, ladies and gentlemen, do you think that everybody has the time to take away their physician use, to queue up in a hospital, to queue up in a clinic to be given by a doctor because they have the inherent paranoia? Now, no, ladies and gentlemen, not everything is cancer. And cancer is a last-minute diagnosis anyway, under which paradigm was cancer actually advertised on TV. Firstly, we have to understand that in the end, a lot of these serious illnesses are chronic in nature and cannot be prescribed over 10 seconds of speaking to a doctor and telling him about your life and how work was today, because that is how the doctors will usually identify what you're going through. No, it's not going to be identified anyway. So let's us understand, not everything is chronic and not everything needs you to spend your time to actually go and visit a doctor to collect a certain kind of medication. All right, let's hear it.
Raj, considering that the nature of diseases is that they are predictable, they may share similar symptoms but different, wouldn't it be safer for you to actually visit a doctor than to actually wait for drugs and then?
All right, yes, sorry. I told you, in the end of the day, if you're visiting your doctor so early because of a certain paranoia that you have in your head, the doctor will not be able to actually, know all these kind of things. Even in cancer, we have to talk about chronic weight loss, we have to talk about, chronic loss of appetite, a lot of things which have to present themselves over a course of 6 months, not because you woke up today feeling a bit off, therefore I need to see a doctor before I just grab myself something that I could easily treat myself. It just doesn't make any logical sense that way. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, a lot of these over-the-counter drugs, firstly, which we have to talk about, we cannot talk about prescription drugs because, firstly, those are not able to be advertised in the same way, and it may involve too many complications. So you see, in terms of symptomatic relief has to be there because people need to be able to relieve their symptoms. What is the point of going on with the rigors in your bones through your day just because you're afraid of having a Panadol that would actually ease your pain? In the end of the day, even in a medical setting, when you do see a doctor, there is already a certain part of a history-taking system, which you might not know about, but let me tell you about it, which involves asking them what they took before they came to see you. Why? Because we know that people will need symptomatic relief, because me and the greatest motivator to self-heal is pain, right? So why deny that symptomatic relief? So in the end of the day, efficacy is secondary, according to Patrick. Efficacy is secondary to say, oh, this is absolutely ludicrous. At the end of the day, a Panadol has to cure, like symptoms. And can you just tell this, that we have created a drug over 20 years and have created a way to actually cope with these kind of symptoms, but instead say, we're going to cut costs and actually present Panadol that does work. No, it's not going to sell. That's why people buy. And advertisements for drugs don't work the same way they do with other things, because one, you're not going to buy a drug every day, according to what Deborah said. You can bombard them to buy drugs. No, it doesn't work. People are only grab a paracetamol. They need to, because they feel like they can talk. If when you need not all the time, bombardment doesn't work the same way. So first, let's understand some other dynamics of the debate we need to understand. Firstly, is we have people to understand that there are lifestyle choices they can make, and let's understand certain kind of diseases if they are sensitive because they will understand. So diseases can be catered for themselves. Understand the and application. Is the picture that picture that they have, they pay attention to their health, pay attention to what the body is, pay attention to what's out in the market that could take you to this kind of things. Most doctors would be able to can't answer because it's not working for him. And in most cases, even if symptoms do persist for all these over-the-counter drugs, they even say at the back of the box, please visit a doctor. Anyway, you see, a lot of these medications can be discussed with the doctors anyway, and doctors should be able to explain it, because I certainly can if I had to see someone. So you see, when it comes to these lifestyle changes, it's important for people. To understand that because there is this medication doesn't mean that they necessarily can treat everything themselves. It's also, I mean, in the end of the day, if we are able to get people to be more concerned about their lifestyles in general, it itself is a positive change that we'd like to see. Now, okay, that aside, let's also talk about the business aspect of medicine, because they want us to talk about that, and so we shall. You see, in the end of the day, pharmaceuticals are also a business. Let's just understand that pharmaceuticals are created to supply and demand. You see, so now let's just understand that companies also not opioid forms of use. Why is that? So because these people are there, and there is market to doctors, when absolutely not necessary. How can they can reach it? So when they create this kind of scenario where it's lucrative for companies to get into, therefore they can actually make this kind of business ventures. And before that, coming to that, I'd just like to address Deborah's point regarding smaller companies not being able to do so. The main reason why small companies don't get their drugs out is because it's really expensive to pay for 10 million volunteers to participate in your third phase of clinical testing. Just understand that. So yes, as we go in, firstly, if there is a promising idea of all these drugs in the end of the day, it is only fair that these drugs have to be presented to people in a way that they can also evaluate, not necessarily just doctors. People should also be able to evaluate what kind of drugs they would expect out of themselves, and also in the end, even if we want to deny a lot of these businesses the lucrative edge that we want to give them, right? It is also important for doctors to know that patients will now be more informed, to allow doctors to be more careful with the decisions they make in the future, which is also inherently important to the entire procedure of prescription. With that, I'd like to close the speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of the District, for speech. Now we would like to call upon Government Witt to end the substantives for government side today.
Thank you.
What are three issues in today's debate? Firstly, should we encourage people to be their own doctors? Secondly, can we trust advertisements to educate our people? And last but not least, this minor issue on the pharmaceutical companies. Let's look at it first, whether we should encourage people to be their own doctors. The opposition told us that, look, advertisements are good because at least it increases awareness of people and empowers them to make decisions on their own. But is awareness truly even necessary in this case? We think in cases of minor illnesses such as flu or cough, patients can resort to over-the-counter drugs, and that's that, right? There's no harm there. But let's talk about major illnesses now when there are two scenarios. Firstly, the harm is this, right? That based on advertisements, patients believe that they have enough to self-medicate, but in fact, these diseases could be just the tip of the iceberg to a host of other diseases which are not then cured. But the second thing to this is, if the patient, if it's a major illness and the patient still resorts and consults a doctor, which the DLO also said, then what is the point of this so-called extra information that you're talking about? Because at the end of the day, exactly what you said, the doctor would still override whatever decisions that these patients would want, whatever these patients want to suggest, right? Like, I want this brand, I want this pill because I'm familiar with it. So at the end of the day, we don't really know what opposition is truly standing for since doctors still overrides. No, thank you. But the problem is this, right? Because under our side, we told you explicitly that the first scenario is far more harmful in terms of this culture of self-medication. Because firstly, there's this issue that is based on the sense of false security, that the psyche of an average patient individual is this, that they would trust brands that they are familiar with simply on the grounds of aesthetics, simply on the grounds of, oh, I've seen that brand before, therefore I trust it. This is the kind of psychology that the average individual would have. Therefore, the priority and judgment then is not solely on the utility and efficacy of the drug, but the general appeal or general familiarity that people have towards a drug that's harmful when people take things in their own hands. We think in any case, you should always err on the side of caution and consult a doctor. We make that trade-off, right? If it means that they so-called, as the LO said, waste money and pay $50 to go see a doctor, we're happy to make that concession because we think it's always good to err on the side of caution and to make that precaution when it comes to your health. That. Secondly, second harm, right? That is regressive towards health. So answering the very first POI that came in this debate, when Whip told us that, look, there are these people who are living in rural areas and they might have a fever, so at least now they have the knowledge that they can just get paracetamol and that's the end of it. But it's harmful because when you assume that this mild fever is just something that you can take a paracetamol and then the very next day you'll be fine. What if, no thank you, because we think the harm is this, that when you prolong the time in which the patient receives a full-on proper diagnosis from a professional doctor is fairly harmful. The fact that it could be this so-called mild fever could be an indicator of far more regressive medical statuses, like perhaps a medulla infection or a viral attack, which cannot be simply solved by a Panadol. We think if you regress the situation when you prolong this time and during this period, that those symptoms could be far more outreaching, and by the time you actually consult a doctor, it may be too late or it may be even worse and harder to cure. So yes, we would rather err on the side. We'd rather have these individuals go to a doctor or consult. We think this element of education does not fully exist under your side. But before I move on, yes, sir.
Speaking about false security, right? People can get sense of false security from someone over the road, say, but we rather it come from an advertisement, whereby it has been regulated and monitored by the Medical and Health Council before they publish the public.
Okay, then let's look at this. The second issue then, can we trust these advertisements to educate? We think, yes, in society, there are many avenues in which people get misinformation. But just because there are many avenues of misinformation does not mean that we allow another avenue to exist. If we are able to prohibit it and able to limit it, then by God, we would do that, right? So let's look at it. Opposition told us that ads are the most important source of medical information. LO, I quote, he said, it was the most rapid form of disseminating knowledge. But we told you from the get-go that these ads are never educational and the focus is always on aesthetics and emotional drama. Madam Chair, I'm sure you've seen this before, right? When advertisements show you some Sally sock story of a father and a daughter for the last 2 minutes, and at the end of it, life insurance company. Or at the end of it, in the last 5 seconds, they show you the brand of that pharmaceutical company. What kind of information do you actually get from advertisements like that? No, thank you. You had a shot, right? Maybe later on you can have a shot at it and tell us about advertisements more. But in your speech, sir, in Aldo's speech, you told us that there are policies in place to make sure that advertisements do not lie. They always adhere to policies and laws. They have laws in check to help. But we told you that the nature of advertisements is that even if they tell the truth, it is selective truth. And when you tell selective truth, that itself can be a harm. When you don't tell us the symptoms and the side effects that could possibly come from taking this drug, we think that in itself is harm. Only show the good side of whatever you are promoting, or even those little disclaimers, like for example, when you call credit card company, the disclaimer of how much percent of you pay is always minimal. Yes, the truth is there, but it's not equally accessible by the average citizen. I think that in itself can be a lie that skews the knowledge and skews the decision-making of people. So this idea of informed choice, we would rather take it up. So the trade-off that is that, no thank you sir, the trade-off is, yes, maybe advertisements will be able to reach a far more greater audience, but the overarching harm is this, that information is misleading, that this information can result in individuals making bad choices and promoting their diseases rather than not have them doing the dissemination of knowledge from doctors or more legitimate sources like medical journals, right? Not from pharmaceutical companies who have vested interests to ensure that their skills are propagated, to ensure that they pharmaceutical companies. Last concern about opposition is this, that there's this supply and demand argument. Companies have for research and but so long as there is an element which is your demand, you will always be patients and doctors who buy these drugs. That supply and demand doesn't really exist. So long as the drug, we think the equal playing field should exist. It should be solely based on efficacy. So substantive was important as well. She told you that in the industries, all the utility and the functionality of the drug is good. The drug other companies to promote you think from the patients problems.
Then we'll wait for it and we'll call it.
Yeah.
Ma'am Chair, the reason that I can stand today and not be a co-medic like other people out there is because when I was a kid, I watched an advertisement that drugs are harmful, right? So, move on. Today's debate. So, side government. Firstly, their case was built honestly pretty slow, and that's pretty slow. And somehow, by watching advertisements, which are apparently always bad in their paradigm, people would become their own doctors, right? That is a slippery slope, and I'll engage that. And also, they do not seem to understand the role of doctors, which under their paradigm apparently will be educate patients. Something in the advertisement, I'll tell you why in a short while as well. So, moving on to the of this, which is source of information, right? Advertisements are a good source of information, and one is doctors are not needed for treatment of symptomatic treatment of normal diseases like fever. These are even if you go to a doctor, all he's going to do is advise you to stay at home and rest. Bring some water. Probably he's going to give you back. He's going to tell you, if symptom persists, please come back. That is what the advertisement tells you as well. So we can clearly see here that what the doctor tells you and what the advertisement tells you are the same thing, right? Moving on. They came here and made a statement because people look at this, it's somehow they will force their particular deny. They'll force their friends to particular. Firstly, what it is for is because if the drug is advertised, it has already been shown to the doctor in the first place. The doctors are already going to prescribe that drug which is advertised in the first place. So even if the patients don't ask the doctor to give that drug, the doctors are going to prescribe that drug anyway. So we see that how the patients go to the doctor to give that particular disease, and the harms to the patient would become also the drug disease. Advertisement plays a role as education. We will talk about advertisement, right? Essentially, bringing me to the next flashback of this debate is freedom of information and role. Society, government, paint the picture how advertisements do not tell the whole truth, right? And how advertisements are needed to pursue a business agenda, right? They will tell you how business agenda of advertisement actually benefits consumers or patients in the next flashpoint. But before that, let me engage on the role of advertisements, right? On how these advertisements actually work. But firstly, advertisements are regulated. The media is regulated, right? You can't put the photo of Osama bin Laden in a panorama advertisement, right? It will not be published. It will not be advertised. right? Advertisements are regulated. And if you do not know, advertisements relating to medicine or advertisements relating to over-the-counter medications are more often than not regulated and are merely a form of health awareness, right? Why are drugs like Panadol advertised and not drugs to treat cancer like your site claims not advertised? Because drugs to treat fever like Panadol can be taken by the patient himself, right? If the patient, the purpose of education in this time is advertisement is education. They want to educate the patient that if you have fever, you can take Panadol, right? But drugs like which treat cancer are advertised. Why? Because a lot of our complications in major illness drugs, which they say engage in what type of opposition say, we over the drugs, we are symptomatic, not major illness. When the disease and then we came and talked about liver cancer, a lot of other illnesses, where they fail to understand where the evolution of this debate. Because my opposition fully clearly says that you will be talking about over-the-counter drugs, and we clearly justify drugs that we not get right because we need a prescription to fully acquire the drug. And those drugs are not being marketed as in the form of advertisement. They are marketed to doctors. Right?
So both and when
all right. Here is where we lead to my next issue of supply and demand. Right. Firstly, we see that supply and demand in terms of medication is a self-limiting cycle. Right. When there are people who seek symptomatic treatment like Panadol, there is a supply. The pharmaceutical companies make this kind of drugs, and they advertise those drugs so that they can meet the supply, so that the demand can meet the supply. It's a self-limiting supply, self-limiting cycle, right? And we see that this empowers consumers, right? Now empowers patients simply because this gives them a sort of ability to acquire these drugs, these over-the-counter drugs, give them empowerment and knowledge and freedom of choice, right? And your side clearly failed to engage in this part of the debate, right? And when the number of people acquiring drugs like Panadol increase, this will improve the profit of pharmaceutical companies. And how I feel this is a good thing is because we wouldn't have hired if there was no research and development. And we see that pharmaceutical companies should be allowed to market their product advertisement in the stance that they would increase their profit. Why? When they increase their profit would be channeled to research and development, which is vital to you guys talked about, right? So we see that, we see this as another benefit in terms of supply and demand, and that's why we feel that point should also go to us. So let me just summarize what happened today, right? Their side clearly failed to understand what health advertisements or what medication advertisements are about. They think it's about makeup advertisements or perfume advertisements that people spray and they get excited. Your side clearly failed to build a case to these things. Right? Folks.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank the opposition whip for I'd like now to call upon the reply speaker for opposition.
All right, let's think about What if it's cancer, ladies and gentlemen? Presentations will last far longer than the patient would like. And there will be plenty of other complications that will be inherently there that would need for it to mandate it to be cancer. Now, ladies and gentlemen, cancer cannot be diagnosed as easily as their side would like to think, and as magically as they would like to believe doctors to be. But whatever, ladies and gentlemen, let's just understand a few things for today. What do we want on our opposition side? We want people to understand that, for one, convenience is in fact a mother of innovation. That through convenience, people and companies would be, to actually given an incentive to improve their products and to improve their dissemination. We want drugs to be more easily available, as it is currently in status quo, more able for people to get it when they need it, and not necessarily be in a state of paranoia where they constantly have to see their doctor and take do something that drugs sufficiently, being able to see that be there because people know about their drugs is a great way for them to be able to recuperate some of their investments and be able to channel some of this into the future to proceed to create better drugs. Also, we want to serve a dual purpose, as well as for people to understand that there are lifestyle choices that people can make, and as well as to understand that healthy understanding of health should start from the basics, and that is with yourself. Also, we wanted to talk about how, in the end, if we want to talk about business, we would like to create a supply and demand chain where we allow companies to have a profitable way to make their drugs known to the people. So let's talk about their side. So in their side, they want us to tell us that sales are more important than efficacy. And like I told you, drugs in the end of the day don't function the same way as most of the advertisements. It will only sell if it actually works. We also want them to understand that if in the end of the day, people are going to self-treat, it's not going to work anyway, because no matter how much paracetamol you take, you will not be able to treat chronic symptoms anyway. So in the end, even if people wanted to self-treat themselves, it wouldn't really work, so it wouldn't really last for long. After 2 weeks of realizing that his fever is not actually getting cured, he would definitely see the doctor. So in the end, most of their arguments are self-limiting. In the end, they say people will understand their problems eventually, and then they would seek out medical guidance. So we have to understand through this debate, in what paradigm
that these advertisements not only create more harm, they need to exist because they are a very important utility. The first argument, and I think that I want to address, which is very important, is this argument of creating a supply and demand chain, so that advertisements create demand, so that companies make money. I'm sorry, but your advertisements don't create demand. Diseases create demand, which means so long as God still allows the diseases to exist and people are still falling sick, people still need to buy drugs. And if they argue that advertisements are able to sway people to the extent where your revenue will substantially increase because of advertisement as concession, saying that these people initially don't need those drugs, but they're only buying those drugs because of advertisement. I don't see in any logical sense how can that be a good. Secondly, They are good because it offers symptomatic relief for minor diseases. Firstly, you don't know if it's a minor disease. A lot of disease have very acute time frame where it can manifest into a big problem. Things such as pneumonia and lung infection. You might think it's just cough and flu, and you just go to the pharmacy and you get a drug and you get it over with, and within that 1 week, symptoms persist, and you think maybe next week I'll go back, but you don't see next week anymore. Things such as acute inflammations, dengue, which people easily dismiss as fever, and all these things don't give you that time frame for you to wait to see if symptoms. Those are the very important things where you need people to at least go to the pharmacy and tell the pharmacist, I have these symptoms, and then the pharmacist will tell you that can be a possibility of a greater disease, you should see a doctor. There is a difference within this debate, right? So, thirdly, well, it's not true anyway that a lot of people, like say you survive the first week and symptoms persist. Not everyone goes to the doctor, especially if you're talking about those people who are poor, who stays in the rural or suburban areas. They now will be able to tip that balance because of the advertisements that they see. Initially, if they think, I will go see the doctor, but because of the desperation of the situation, they rather resort to advertisements, to what they see on TV and think that those are the cure that they only need and not see the doctor. Those are the trade-offs. And we're looking about people and real lives which are substantially harmed. And that is why it's very, very bad. But fourthly, they say, advertisements are important to provide information, but we think we argue substantially. Advertisement within that 15 to 30 seconds of time frame of showing you good pictures like dogs frolicking in a garden of flowers don't really educate you. If they are educational, like they tell you, they cite journals and they tell you the side effects, people probably won't watch the advertisement. Let's say you're very hardworking, and if the advertisement is educational and you still watch it, that means you are much less likely to go and actually visit a doctor because you think you know it all. And those are very actual problems that we face. Ultimately, it is this false sense of security that people think they know it, that people, because of the advertisement, they think they rely less on doctor. When they ask for certain drugs from doctors and the doctors don't give them, that slowly erodes the trust, and people miss that critical time frame of curing very important active diseases. Secondly, let's talk about access to OTC. All the harms that they say, people need, people who have a fever and want some immediate relief, that still exists because you can still buy over-the-counter drugs. You can still buy Panadol even without advertisement. So the difference in this debate between the sole difference is those people who will be affected by advertisement, which means I have a fever, I don't need the advertisement to tell me that I get Panadol. I go to a pharmacy and I consult the pharmacist. So to the extent where you are susceptible to advertisement, you delay the critical time frame, you lose your trust in the doctor, and you create high barriers of fees to the people of the smaller pharmaceutical companies who wants to penetrate the market.
Yeah.
Right, thank you, speakers.